Well, friends, we've come to the end of our journey at quickly looking at God's holy days. We've seen how in each one Jesus was clearly pictured. This final one is the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a feast of great joy and celebration. And during this festival, there was a tradition, there was a practice that took place in the temple every year. And this was called the water libation ceremony. Now, why is that important? What does that mean? Consider what John said in chapter 7, verse 37. He said, on the last and the greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Why does John say on the last and greatest day of what? Of the feast. Sometimes we say, John, why did he get so bogged down with all these details? Just tell us he went to the temple and tell us what happened. But no, John is very careful. He doesn't just say, oh, some feast day, but on the last and greatest day of the feast. Why? Because that's a sign for us. The last and great day of the feast takes place on the Feast of Tabernacles. And that's when this water libation ceremony would take place. Now think about this. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world would go to the temple to celebrate Tabernacles. And every year the priest had these empty pitchers. And he would take them down to the pool of Siloam filled with living water. And when he would get there, he would dip these containers in them and he would fill them to the maximum. He would bring them back up to the temple area. And then during part of the ceremony, the priest would take the water and he would dump it. Now remember, that's living water, and he's dumping it on the altar. Why is he doing this? Because water in Jerusalem is life. It was a very dry place, and you needed water for your crops, you needed it for your flocks. If you had water, you had life. And while they poured out the water, they were saying, God, send us your living water, not just physically, but also spiritually. Living water was another way of saying the Messiah. And they were saying, God, would you send us the Messiah? We're dry, we're thirsty. This religion of works, it's not working, God. There needs to be more. And John says, on the last and the greatest day of the feast, Jesus comes into the temple. The very moment where the priest took the water and he began to pour it on the altar and said, God, send us your living water, that's the moment where Jesus comes. And he says to them, what you're asking God for is right here, it's in me. And he says, in fact, if you drink of me, rivers of living water. What the people had been anticipating, what they'd been expecting, what they'd been hoping for, all of those years was for God to send the living water. And Jesus said, that's me, I'm here. We can see how he is so clearly pictured in all of these feasts. Friends, it's good to have the holidays, but it's also good to know the holy days, because as we learn about them, we learn more and more about our God.